I used to believe that no pathogen could truly surprise me anymore. Decades spent studying viruses and bacteria, charting their predictable patterns of destruction, had hardened me to their horrors. But the vein rot? It mocked everything I thought I knew. It didn't behave like a disease, it behaved like a curse. The last recorded death was 12 minutes ago. A man named Harris Gant, 57 years old, married, no children. I'd overseen his care personally. He'd fought until the final minutes, clutching at my sleeve as if sheer willpower could hold his failing organs together. His eyes, once bright with the stubborn optimism typical of settlers, had dulled to the same lifeless grey as the others before him. I barely had time to finish recording his symptoms when the emergency alert buzzed, announcing the arrival of another patient. The infirmary feels smaller with every body we cram into it. The colony had never prepared for this. A plague that spreads faster than we can track it, kills quicker than we can react. The medical bay, built to handle broken bones and minor infections, now resembles a battlefield morgue. The diagnostic scanners, meant for routine health checks, scream their mechanical protests every time we force them to process another patient. I stared at the log entries on my terminal. 56 dead. No survivors. And despite my efforts, no progress. I'd always prided myself on being a man of reason, but watching lesion-covered bodies collapse under the weight of this thing has begun to chip away at that confidence. The lesions start small, reddish blotches near the joints, and spread with the relentless advance of spilled ink seeping across parchment. Within hours, victims are writhing in agony, their internal systems shutting down as the disease consumes them from the inside out. There's no discernible pattern to its transmission. Some succumb within days, others hold out for weeks. What little we know about its spread comes from trial and error, isolating families, tracing contacts, and still, it spreads. Every theory I've proposed collapses under scrutiny. It doesn't follow any biological logic. None that I understand, anyway. I caught sight of my reflection in the terminal's darkened screen. My face, hollowed by weeks without proper sleep, stared back at me. The air filtration mask dangled loosely from my neck, a futile charm against the invisible force that had already claimed so many. The lab coat I wore, a stark white in better days, was stained and crumpled, a sign of how far things had fallen. The colony outside the infirmary wasn't faring much better. I'd heard the rumors during my rare ventures out. Riots at the food distribution center, people sealing themselves into their prefab shelters, families turning on each other over suspicions of infection. The colonial authorities' quarantine order had sealed that fate. Necessary containment measures, they'd called it. Necessary for whom? Not us, certainly. A knock on the infirmary door pulled me from my thoughts. It was Lucas, one of the few volunteers who hadn't yet abandoned his post. His wide, sweat-slicked face peered in, eyes darting nervously. "Another one," he said. "Hargrove from Sector 3. Early stages, but it's spreading fast." I nodded and stood. The routine kicked in as I grabbed gloves, mask and tablet. "Prep a cot," I said, "and don't touch him without full protection. Last thing we need is another volunteer down." Lucas didn't answer, just shuffled away, leaving me to my thoughts. On the way to the isolation ward, I passed Harris Gant's cot. His body had already been covered with a sheet, but I could see the dark stains where the lesions had burst. When I reached the ward, the scene was all too familiar. A pale man clutching at his arm, trying to hide the vivid red streak crawling toward his elbow. His breathing was shallow, each exhale a shuddering rasp. I scanned him, noting the telltale signs, the blotches near his joints, the feverish glint in his eyes. The rot had him. "I told my wife I'd be fine," Hargrove murmured, his voice brittle. "Just a scratch. Didn't think it'd turn out like this." He coughed, and a fleck of blood landed on the sheet. I didn't have the heart to tell him there was nothing I could do. Instead, I muttered something about running more tests and stepped back to give the scanner room to work. It beeped once before spitting out a damning report. Systemic infection, no viable treatment, time to fatality estimated at 8 hours. I noted the details and left, heading back to my office. On the way, I overheard snippets of conversation from the nurses and volunteers. Most of it was the usual, updates on supplies, complaints about the quarantine. But one word caught my attention. Doctor. What about a doctor? I stopped in my tracks, turning to face the speaker. It was Lucas, wiping his hands on his apron. He hesitated, glancing at the others before answering. Not a doctor exactly. Some guy showed up near the perimeter, wearing a mask, like one of those old plague doctors from history vids. Says he's here to help. I stared at him, incredulous. You're joking. No joke, Lucas said. The council's already talking about letting him in. People are saying he knows how to stop the rot. I should have dismissed it as nonsense. A charlatan's trick, some desperate colonist's idea of a prank. But there was something in Lucas's tone. A glimmer of hope. The kind of hope that people in Duskspire had long since abandoned. I didn't say anything. I just turned back to my office and shut the door. Who was this stranger? And how had he come here through the quarantine with a cure for something that defied all reason? By morning, word had spread across the colony. The council was convening an emergency meeting to decide whether this self-proclaimed savior would be allowed to help. I didn't expect much from the discussion. Just more shouting, more desperation. But I knew I had to be there. The council chamber was a repurposed cafeteria, a relic of the colony's early optimism. Now, its long tables and rows of benches felt desolate, a space too large for the handful of people left to debate Duskspire's future. Voices were rising and falling as I stood near the back, arms crossed, trying to stay unnoticed. It wasn't hard. Desperation made people blind to anyone not shouting louder than the rest. "We've tried everything else," an older man named Kilroy barked, slamming his hand against the table. "What's the harm in hearing him out? It's not like he could make things worse." "Not worse?" snapped Redding, one of the council's more pragmatic members. His sharp, angular face was set in a permanent grimace. "We don't even know what he is. He shows up in the middle of a quarantine, no explanation, no credentials, just a mask and a promise. You want to trust that?" "I want to trust anything at this point," Kilroy shot back. "You've seen the numbers. We're done if we don't try something." The room buzzed with agreement. Arguments rippled through the crowd like an undercurrent, too fractured and desperate to form a consensus. I stayed silent, content to let the debate run its course. My stance on the matter was clear enough. A stranger with a medieval costume and vague assurances didn't belong in our infirmary, let alone making decisions about the colony's survival. But then the doors opened, and silence followed, like a wave. He entered slowly, deliberate in every step, his silhouette framed by the red glow of the corridor lights. The beaked mask gave him a bird-like profile, its polished surface catching the light in strange, angular reflections. His clothing, robes of deep black, flowing and unwrinkled despite their antiquated cut, seemed immune to the grime and dust that clung to the rest of us. Before he arrived, the room was overwhelmed with coughing, wheezing and muttering. But now, it felt suffocatingly quiet. He paused at the head of the chamber, hands clasped in front of him like a preacher about to give a sermon. "Good people of Duskspire," he said, his voice smooth and calm, yet carrying an unnatural resonance that filled the room. "I am here to help." There was no accent, no regional inflection, just words that felt carefully chosen and stripped of context. It was the kind of voice you wanted to trust, even as every instinct screamed otherwise. Kilroy broke the silence first. "You say you can cure the rot. How? What do you know about it?" The masked figure inclined his head. "I know this affliction well. It is a manifestation of the great pestilence, a scourge I have dedicated my existence to eradicating. I have the means to save you, If you will allow me. The Great Pestilence, Redding scoffed, rising from his seat. What the hell does that mean? We need science, not riddles. The doctor turned his head toward Redding, the beak of his mask tilting in what might have been curiosity. Science, he said, as if tasting the word. A fine tool, though often blind to the true nature of illness. The pestilence is not merely biological, it is deeper, insidious, woven into the fabric of existence. But worry not. I have dealt with it before, and I will deal with it again. I shifted my weight, biting back the urge to speak. His words were nonsense, clearly the product of some deranged mind. And yet, there was something unnerving about the way he carried himself. He wasn't pleading, wasn't desperate to prove himself. He spoke with the certainty of a man who had long since stopped questioning his purpose. Kilroy glanced around the room, looking for support. Look, he's offering to help. Can we really afford to turn him away? Redding shook his head. And if he makes things worse? If he spreads the disease faster? Or kills more people with his so-called cure? We don't even know what he wants in return. I ask for nothing but cooperation, the doctor said smoothly. Provide me with a space to work, and I will do the rest. The results will speak for themselves. Redding opened his mouth to argue, but the murmurs of the crowd were turning against him. People were nodding, leaning toward Kilroy's side. The argument had stopped being about logic. It was about hope, or the illusion of it. And when you're dying, illusions are often all you have left. The council eventually voted, though it was clear from the start how it would end. Kilroy led the charge, swaying the undecided with grim declarations of doom if we didn't act now. Redding abstained, his face set in frustration. I didn't vote. I wasn't technically on the council, and besides, my opinion wouldn't have mattered. By the time the vote was counted, the doctor had his answer. A laboratory would be set up in the infirmary's east wing, and he would be given free rein to begin his work. As the crowd dispersed, I lingered near the door, watching him. He stood perfectly still, hands clasped, the beak of his mask angled slightly downward as if in thought. There was no celebration, no gratitude, only a poised stillness that felt like the calm before something breaking. When the room was empty, I approached him. You'll forgive me for being skeptical, I said, but I've seen what this disease does. If you think you can beat it, you'll need to explain how. The doctor turned to face me, and though the mask concealed his expression, I felt the weight of his gaze. I understand your doubt, he said softly, but my methods are delicate. They require precision and time, and I am not accustomed to explaining them to those untrained in their intricacies. Suffice it to say, I will succeed. That's not an answer, I pressed. It is the only answer I can give, he replied. He stepped past me, his robes whispering against the floor as he headed toward the infirmary. I watched him go, my mind racing with questions I couldn't yet articulate. There was something wrong about him, something that didn't fit, but I couldn't deny the flicker of relief I'd seen in the eyes of the other colonists. To them, he was hope made flesh. To me, he was a mystery I couldn't afford to ignore. The infirmary's east wing had been gutted overnight. Cots were pushed against the walls, diagnostic scanners relocated, and a dozen crates of medical supplies left half unpacked in the hallway. In their place stood a stark array of instruments that looked like they'd been pulled from a nightmare. Hooks, tongs, bone saws, and surgical knives gleamed under the overhead lights, meticulously arranged on steel trays. Beside them were vials of unknown liquids ranging in color from pale green to deep crimson, labeled in symbols I couldn't read. The equipment seemed archaic, but it exuded a strange precision, as if each piece had been crafted for a purpose beyond human understanding. The doctor moved through this grim tableau with quiet efficiency. He didn't seem to notice or care that the volunteers avoided the East Wing entirely. Even Lucas, who had once been eager to help wherever he could, muttered an excuse and stayed out of sight whenever the doctor appeared. I didn't blame him. There was something profoundly unsettling about the way the doctor worked. There was no warmth in his actions, no trace of the empathy that defined even the most hardened physicians. I told myself I was only here to observe. Someone had to document his methods, if only to make sense of what was happening. But in truth, I stayed because I couldn't look away. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something darker, a compulsion to witness the line between life and death being redrawn in front of me. The first procedure I witnessed was on a man named Kane. He was a minor, one of the earliest infected, and by the time the doctor selected him, he was little more than a husk. His skin was mottled with lesions, his breathing shallow and irregular. I'd estimated he had less than a day left. He barely reacted as the doctor's gloved hands lifted him onto the operating table, his body limp as a doll's. "You intend to cure him?" I asked. The words felt absurd the moment I spoke them. Kane's condition was beyond anything modern medicine could reverse. A cure implied recovery, a return to the life he'd had before. The thought was laughable. "I intend to free him from the pestilence," the doctor replied without looking up. He selected a scalpel from his tray and began making precise incisions along Kane's chest. There was no hesitation, no pause for thought, as if he were following a script only he could see. The process defied every medical principle I'd ever studied. The doctor worked with a precision that was almost mechanical, yet the tools he used should have been wholly inadequate. The scalpel, ancient in design, cut through skin and muscle as easily as a laser. The clamps, crude and rustless, held arteries in place without tearing them, and the fluids, those strange vivid liquids, reacted with Kane's exposed tissue in ways I couldn't explain. One vial turned necrotic flesh a healthy pink, another sealed incisions as if stitching were an afterthought. "What are you doing to him? This isn't medicine! This is—" "Restoration," the doctor interrupted, his tone as calm as ever. "The pestilence corrupts the body, twists it from its intended form. I am simply returning it to what it was meant to be." I opened my mouth to argue, but stopped when I noticed Kane's breathing had changed. It was steady now, even, a rhythm I hadn't expected. His lesions, once angry and raw, were fading, the skin beneath them smooth and unblemished. For a fleeting moment I felt a surge of hope. Maybe this madman was onto something. But then Kane opened his eyes. At first I thought it was a reflex, a muscle spasm from the trauma of the procedure. But his eyes moved, locking onto the doctor. His pupils were pinpricks, his irises a dull grey. When the doctor stepped back, Kane sat up slowly. There was no confusion, no disorientation, just an unnatural stillness that made my stomach twist. "How do you feel?" the doctor asked, his voice devoid of any real curiosity. Kane didn't answer. He didn't even seem to hear the question. His head turned slowly, scanning the room mechanically. When his eyes fell on me, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. There was no recognition in his expression, no trace of the man I'd known. He was empty, a shell filled with something I couldn't define. This isn't right," I said, taking a step back. "He's not cured, He is free," the doctor interrupted, his voice firm. "Free of pain, free of decay, free of the pestilence." "He's a corpse," I snapped, "a walking corpse." The doctor turned to me, his posture as calm as ever. "A corpse is a body without purpose. He has purpose now." I stared at him, struggling to find the words. The room felt colder, the air heavier, as if the very act of speaking had shifted the balance of the world around us. The thing that had been Kane climbed down from the table and stood silently by the wall, his blank eyes staring into the distance. The procedure was declared a success. Word spread quickly, and soon more families were volunteering their loved ones for the doctor's cure. I tried to argue against it, but my voice was drowned out by the growing chorus of desperation. People didn't care about the cost. They only saw the results. Patients who should have been dead were walking, moving, obeying commands. The doctor's reputation grew with every reanimated colonist, and the infirmary became a factory for the cured. But as their numbers grew, so did the unease. The cured didn't speak, didn't eat, didn't sleep. They moved in perfect unison, performing tasks with an efficiency that was almost inhuman. And their presence changed the colony in ways I couldn't fully articulate. People stopped talking in the halls, their voices hushed as the cured passed by. The infirmary felt less like a place of healing and more like a mausoleum. I began keeping detailed notes, logging every procedure, every change I observed in the cured. I told myself it was for the sake of science, but deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't looking for answers. I was looking for a way out, for a way to stop what was happening before it consumed us all. The sound of silence had become unbearable. It wasn't the absence of noise. I still heard the noise of life support systems, the hiss of air filters, and the heavy steps of colonists moving through the corridors. But the human sounds, the ones that reminded me we were still alive, were fading. Laughter, arguments, even the muffled sobs of grief had been swallowed by the stillness that followed the cured wherever they went. I sat in my office, staring at the terminal where I'd been documenting the doctor's work. The logs were meticulous, filled with observations about his methods, the changes in his patients, and the growing number of volunteers. But what haunted me were the gaps, the questions I couldn't answer. How were the cured sustained? Why didn't they speak? What had the doctor done to them that defied everything I knew about biology? I replayed the same recordings, hoping to find something I'd missed, but the truth eluded me like smoke through my fingers. A knock on the door startled me. It was Lucas. He hesitated before stepping inside, his hands clenched at his sides. "You need to see this," he whispered. I followed him through the infirmary, past rows of cots now occupied by patients awaiting the doctor's attention. Most were beyond saving by conventional means, their bodies ravaged by the vein rot. They stared at me with empty eyes, silently pleading for relief I couldn't provide. It felt like walking through a graveyard where the dead were still breathing. Lucas led me to the east wing, where the doctor's lab had expanded into what used to be a storage area. The space was dark, filled with his array of tools and vials, but it wasn't the lab that held my attention. It was the figure standing in the center of the room. It was Kane. He stood perfectly still, his arms at his sides, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something we couldn't hear. His skin had taken on a waxy quality, the lesions from his infection replaced by unnervingly smooth patches of flesh. But it was his eyes that sent a chill through me. They were no longer human, the irises dull and cloudy, reflecting the light in a way that seemed wrong. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood 3 others, similarly transformed, their movements synchronized as they turned to face us. "They've been doing that all morning," Lucas said. "Just standing there, watching. It's like they're waiting for something." "Where's the doctor?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "In the other room. He said they were resting." Lucas hesitated, then added, "Adrian, this isn't right. I don't care what he says. This isn't a cure." I couldn't argue. What we were witnessing wasn't natural. "Keep an eye on them," I said, "and don't get too close." The doctor was in his private workspace, hunched over a table where a fresh patient lay unconscious. He didn't look up as I entered, his gloved hands moving with methodical care. The smell of antiseptic and copper filled the air, mingling with something sweet that I couldn't place. I watched in silence as he injected a syringe of clear liquid into the patient's neck, the fluid spreading through their veins in a slow pulse. "Do you ever question the cost of this?" I asked finally, breaking the quiet. "What you're doing to them?" The doctor paused, turning his head slightly in my direction. The beak of his mask glinted under the light. "The cost is irrelevant," he said. "What matters is the result." "And the result is what exactly? Turning them into that?" I gestured toward the door where the cured were still waiting. "They are free of the pestilence," he replied calmly. "Free from the decay that would have consumed them. They serve a greater purpose now." "That's not a cure," I snapped. "You're not saving them. You're erasing them." The doctor straightened. "You misunderstand, Dr. Corrin. The pestilence is not merely a disease of the body. It is a corruption of the soul, a sickness that festers within all living things. My work is not destruction, it is restoration." His words chilled me to the core. There was no doubt in his voice, no hint of hesitation. To him, this wasn't experimentation, it was destiny. "You don't even know what the vein rot is," I said. "How can you claim to understand it when it defies everything we've seen before?" "I know it intimately," he said, stepping closer. "I have seen its kind before, in many forms, across many places. This is not the first time I have fought the pestilence, nor will it be the last. It is the great adversary of existence, and I have sworn to eradicate it." I wanted to argue, to demand answers that made sense, but the weight of his words left me speechless. He turned back to his work, dismissing me without another glance. By the time I left the lab, the unease had settled into my bones. The colony was changing. The cured moved among us like silent sentinels, their presence warping the air around them. People stopped making eye contact, their conversations reduced to whispers. That night, I sat in my quarters staring at the data I'd collected. It wasn't enough. I needed to know more to see what the doctor saw. And so, I made a decision I knew I would regret. I would watch his next procedure up close, no matter what it cost me. Just as I reached for my tablet to make a final record of my thoughts, a sharp knock broke the silence. I opened the door to find Lucas standing there. "You're going back there, aren't you?" he said without preamble. My initial instinct was to deny it, but there was no point in lying. He knew me too well by now. "Yes," I said. "I need to see it. Whatever the doctor is doing, it goes beyond anything we understand. If you don't what?" he interrupted. "Catch him in the act. Figure out some grand secret. He's not playing by any rules we know. He's dangerous, and you can't just walk in there alone and expect to, reason with him? Then come with me." Lucas stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tightening. "Fine," he said eventually. "But if this goes sideways, we get out. No arguments." The infirmary had never been quiet, not truly. Even at its emptiest, there was always the noise of equipment, the murmur of voices, the shuffle of footsteps against the flooring. But tonight, the stillness was suffocating. I stood outside the doctor's lab, my hand hovering over the panel to open the door, torn between the need to know and the fear of what I might see. I pressed the panel, and the door slid open. The room felt colder than the rest of the infirmary, though the temperature hadn't changed. The harsh overhead lights cast sharp reflections on the polished metal of the doctor's instruments, giving the space a clinical gleam. The smell of antiseptic mingled with something earthy like decaying leaves. At the center of the room was the operating table, and on it lay the colony's chief engineer, Redding. I froze. This wasn't right. Redding hadn't been sick. He'd been one of the few who'd resisted the vein rot's spread. I had spoken to him earlier that day, his sharp voice cutting through the council's usual bickering. Yet here he was, unconscious and restrained, his face pale but untouched by the lesions that marked the infected. The doctor stood at the head of the table, his hands methodically arranging his tools. He didn't look up as I entered, but his voice carried through the room with its usual calm. "You shouldn't be here, Dr. Corrin." "What is this?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Why is Redding here? He wasn't infected." The doctor tilted his head slightly, as if considering my question. "The pestilence is not always visible," he said. "It resides within, festering in ways the untrained eye cannot perceive. Redding's symptoms were subtle but unmistakable." "That's absurd!" I snapped, stepping closer to the table. "You're taking healthy people now? Is that what this is? Some twisted justification for—" "Dr. Corrin." His voice cut through mine, calm but firm, like a blade wrapped in silk. "You do not understand the nature of my work. This is not about health or disease in the terms you know. The pestilence is a corruption of the very essence of life, and it must be purged wherever it is found. I wanted to argue, to shout that he was wrong, but the words stuck in my throat. Redding stirred on the table, a faint groan escaping his lips. I moved to his side, checking his pulse. Steady, strong. He wasn't sick. He was unconscious, drugged, but otherwise fine. "This isn't curing him," I said, glaring at the doctor. "This is experimentation. Whatever you're doing here, it's not medicine." The doctor finally turned to face me, his mask catching the light. "I have seen what the pestilence does when left unchecked," he said. "It consumes entire worlds, leaves civilizations in ruin. You may not see its signs, but I do, and I will not allow it to spread." Redding's eyes fluttered open, and he looked at me, confusion clouding his gaze. "Adrian," he murmured. What's happening?" "Stay calm," I said, gripping his shoulder. "I'm getting you out of here." "No," the doctor said. "He cannot leave. The procedure is already underway." I glanced down and saw the thin incision running along Redding's arm, one of the doctor's strange solutions seeping into his veins. Panic surged in my chest. "This has to stop," I said, my voice rising. "He's not infected. He doesn't need your cure." "The cure is not for him," the doctor replied, his tone colder now. "It is for all of you." Lucas glanced at me, confused. "What does that even mean?" The sound of a door opening drew our attention. Across the room, a side door I hadn't noticed before swung open, revealing two figures stepping into the lab. It took me a moment to recognize them. Kane and another of the earlier cured. They moved with the same unsettling precision, their blank eyes fixed on us as they crossed the threshold. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as they advanced, their movements smooth but utterly devoid of humanity. They didn't lurch, didn't falter, just walked, steady and deliberate, stopping a few feet away. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lucas took a step back, his hand hovering near the pistol on his belt. "What are they doing?" "They are ensuring my work is undisturbed," the doctor said calmly. "It is essential that this procedure is completed without interference." "You can't be serious," I said, my voice rising. "This isn't medicine. This isn't curing anyone. You're turning them into tools." The doctor tilted his head slightly. "You misunderstand, Dr. Corrin. They are more than tools. They are free from the pestilence, elevated beyond the weaknesses that once defined them. They act as protectors of this truth." Kane and the other cured remained motionless, but their presence was suffocating. They weren't just standing guard, they were watching, observing, as if waiting for the slightest provocation. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest. I realized I was holding my breath. Lucas's hand inched closer to his pistol. "This is insane," he said through clenched teeth. "They're not protectors, they're prisoners, and I'm not just going to stand here and let this happen." Before he could draw the weapon, Kane took a step forward. It wasn't a threat, not exactly. There was no sudden movement, no aggression in his stance, but it was enough. Enough to freeze Lucas in place, his hand faltering as he locked eyes with the blank, unfeeling gaze of what had once been a man. "Lucas," I said quietly. "Don't." The tension in the room was unbearable. My mind raced. But what could I do against this? Against him? Against them? "I think it's time for you to leave," the doctor said. He gestured toward the door with a gloved hand. "My work demands focus. You will understand soon enough." Lucas tensed beside me, his fists clenched, but I placed a hand on his arm. "Let's go. We're not going to win this fight here." He hesitated, his jaw tight before nodding reluctantly. Together we backed toward the door, the cured following at a measured distance. Their silence was oppressive, their movements synchronized in a way that felt more like choreography than instinct. As we exited the lab, the cured stopped just short of the doorway, standing like sentinels to ensure we didn't return. The door slid shut behind us, cutting off the glow of the lab and leaving us in the corridor. Lucas let out a shaky breath, his hand finally dropping away from his pistol. It was like they weren't even human anymore. They're not, I said, the words heavy in my throat. Not in the way we understand. Whatever the doctor's done to them, it's taken away something fundamental. And he doesn't care. To him, this is progress. I glanced back at the sealed door, the light leaking out from its edges. Inside, the doctor was continuing his work, unbothered by our departure. Kane and the others would guard him, their unblinking vigilance ensuring his procedures would remain undisturbed. Whatever the doctor was doing, it was spreading through the colony like the very disease he claimed to be fighting. And if we didn't stop it soon, there wouldn't be anyone left to save. The East Wing was silent now. Lucas and I stood at the edge of the infirmary's main corridor, staring at the sealed door as if it might spring open at any moment. Redding was still in there, and the doctor was still working. Hours passed. We moved through the colony, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the paths of the cured who now wandered the halls with purpose I didn't understand. They weren't aggressive, but their mere presence was suffocating. They worked in silence, moving supplies, repairing systems, cleaning up what remained of lives that were no longer their own. It was a grotesque mimicry of order, as if the colony had become a theatre and these were its actors, performing a play for an audience that no longer existed. Lucas kept muttering about going back for Redding, about stopping the doctor before it was too late. But I couldn't give him an answer. What could we do? The cured. They weren't something you could fight. Not in the conventional sense. They didn't tire, didn't hesitate. They just were. The next day, we returned to the doctor's lab. The door was standing wide open. Lucas gripped his pistol tightly as we stepped inside. The room was eerily still. No sound, no movement, and no sign of the doctor. His instruments remained arranged with meticulous precision, the vials and tools untouched. The operating table was vacant, and even the cured who had once stood guard had vanished without a trace. I stepped inside, my eyes sweeping over the room. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. No footprints, no sign of struggle, no indication of where he might have gone. The only thing left behind was his presence lingering like a pressure in the air. A new sound reached us, the heavy thud of boots echoing down the corridor. Lucas tensed, his pistol half raised, but I placed a steadying hand on his arm and shook my head. These weren't the movements of the cured. They were too precise, too intentional, human. The first figure appeared in the doorway, clad in matte black tactical gear that absorbed the light. The helmet they wore obscured their features, the visor reflecting the dim glow of the lab's equipment. A patch on their arm bore the insignia of the SCP Foundation. "Clear," the figure said, their voice sharp and clipped. Others followed, weapons raised, their movements efficient as they swept through the room. Their rifles were sleek, compact, outfitted with attachments I couldn't identify. They wore air-sealed suits, their breathing faintly audible through hidden filtration units. One of them approached, lowering their weapons slightly as they addressed us. "Dr. Adrian Corran?" they asked, their voice distorted by the helmet's modulator. "Yes," I said cautiously. "We're with the Foundation," they said. "You're coming with us." Lucas bristled beside me. "What do you mean, coming with you? What's going on?" The operative didn't respond. Instead, they glanced back at one of their team members who was scanning the lab with a handheld device. The screen emitted a blue glow, lines of data scrolling rapidly. "No sign of the target," the second operative said. "He's gone." The first operative's posture stiffened. "Confirmed?" "Confirmed," the second said. "Residual traces of anomalous activity, but no direct presence." The leader turned back to us. "The entity you encountered is no longer here. You'll be debriefed off-site. For now, follow protocol and do exactly as we say." "What about the colony?" I asked. "What about the cured?" Another operative answered, their tone cold and matter-of-fact. "Containment measures are already underway." I didn't need to ask what that meant. The look on Lucas's face told me he understood too. The Foundation team moved quickly, securing the area and herding us toward the main exit. I caught glimpses of them placing devices in strategic locations, small, nondescript machines. I didn't ask what they were for. I didn't want to know. As we left the infirmary, I glanced back one last time. The lab, the instruments, the traces of the doctor's work. It would all be gone soon, erased as if it had never existed. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The doctor had vanished, but his presence lingered. His work wasn't finished. Not here, and not elsewhere. We were loaded onto a transport, the colony disappearing behind us as the vehicle lifted off. Lucas sat silently beside me, his hands clenched into fists. I stared out the window, watching the crimson surface of the planet fade into the distance. The Foundation operatives spoke in hushed tones, their voices blending with the hum of the transport's engines. I caught fragments of their conversation, references to SCP-049, to containment breaches, to protocols I couldn't begin to understand. And then, for the first time in weeks, I felt the weight of exhaustion settle over me. The fight was over, but the questions remained. Who or what was the doctor? What had he truly done to the colony? And why had he left without finishing his work? As the transport carried us away, I couldn't help but wonder if we had escaped, or if we had merely been spared.